Okay, so we found out a bit about you. You found out a bit about myself and Deborah. And now we're here to talk about the role of Belbin and change. There's so many different types of change, isn't there, Deborah? I mean, it's such a big subject. We're not here to give you a lecture on, you know, the different types of change, etc. I mean, Deborah, you've been working, like I said, for 19 years with teams through Belbin. I mean, working, you know, but before then as well. What types of change have you seen teams go through over the years?
Gosh, I mean, so much. I suppose the most often we're called in when there's change because there's strategic change, there's the organisation is changing, then when there's mergers, when there's a change of lead, if there's someone new coming in to run the organisation, and sometimes it's if there's change of personnel generally, you know, there's been some people leaving and some people joining, and I mean, I could just go on, really. I'm sure people here can think of, there's so much, and there's also sort of environmental change. I mean, we can't ignore the fact that obviously currently and over the last year there has been probably some of the biggest changes that many of us have seen, you know, ever perhaps, but certainly for a long time. So all of those people sometimes think they're very different. I mean, of course they are, but a lot of the elements of change are going to be the same each time. And I have a quote which Joe gets a bit fed up with me saying, but it is one of my favorites. It's a bit of a cliche now, but the only constant in life is change. And, you know, most of you probably know, but it was Heraclitus in 500 BC who said that. So, you know, it's not new that it's change, but it is a constant.
Yeah, it's interesting you said that, because Nigel Belbin, who's Meredith Belbin's son, was in the office today, and we were going through, I've got copious notes, you can't see them, thank goodness, at what we were going to be talking about today. And he said, change. He said, now, I'm sure we ran a not webinar, obviously it wasn't invented then, a lecture about Belbin and change back in I don't remember what year it was, 82 or something. And he said, change is always on the agenda, because nothing ever stays the same, does it?
And
so, sorry.
No, I was just going to say that sometimes people think, oh, well, change is really good or change is really bad. You know, that's what we find quite often. Of course, I'm stating the blindingly obvious, but, you know, not all change is good and not all change is bad. It's, you know, it often means, though, that it's very stressful for people.
Absolutely.
That's the thing.
I'd just like to point out that the other constant in life is obviously taxes. Somebody just pointed
I saw someone
put that. Change and tax. Great. Yes, absolutely. And I think the situation we're in at the moment is, if we think back to 12, 13 months ago, especially here in the UK, change was thrust upon us, wasn't it? And that kind of change is very different to a planned change, a change where you can, you know, plan and organise and manage what's going on. I don't know about a lot of you, but there's been very much a case of, you know, 13 months ago, it was very much, I'd call, seat of your pants change, wasn't it? It was, nobody knew what they were doing from one day to the next. But we seem to have got into this period of new normal now, haven't we? I'd say it's we're kind of used to this sort of flux and whatever this new normal is, but it looks like it's changed again.
Well, I find this interesting because in a way, you know, some people with the changes that we had about a year ago, I think some people embrace that and are more comfortable with it. Some people railed against it. But what's happened is that expression you used of the new normal, but in many cases, people have now got used to whatever it is, so that we can't really just go back. You know, it's not about saying, how was it pre-pandemic, now that we're starting to sort of filter back to work, because in a way that coming back and doing something, we're now in the change. You know, it's
so you're saying it's linear, isn't it? It's not just flicking back to how it used to be. We're in a process. I hate using the word because we're not on X Factor, but it's a journey, isn't it? We're going forward and we're continuing along this line of change. So it's not flicking back. So we do perhaps have time to prepare.
Hopefully it's not quite as rushing at things now. We've now got some sort of ideas and some structure, and I think it's about, you know, bringing teams together and really understanding for those teams what's going on, and for the people, because of course we're talking about change and just this word that we bandy about, but we're remembering that it's the individuals that are making the change, and that some individuals have gone through quite a major amount of change. I mean, perhaps we'll pick up on that a little bit later, but I think it's really important to think about just the impact that it has had on individuals as well, and then coming back to working in person with people, what that means. Have people been on voyages of self-discovery? I'm probably jumping ahead a little bit here.
I think that's important. We will make sure that we come back to that point, Deborah. I think it's really important that we don't plan for change without remembering how people have changed already over the last year or so. Right. So we're getting lots of phone calls and inquiries into the offices. I'm sure a lot of you are as well, from managers and from people who manage teams, saying, how can we now plan for this? Because what did happen a year ago, obviously, is lots of decisions were made when change was quite stressful. Are they the best plans to make, Deborah? I think that's just as you take. Are they the best times to make? When is the best time for change, I suppose, and making decisions about it?
I mean, we had actually over the last week or two been sort of laughing really about this, but it's often the case that some of the most major decisions end up being made at a period of the most stress, and of course that is not actually the healthiest time to do it. And I was reminded of I will paraphrase, rather misquote George Bernard Shaw, but when he said, look, when you're in love and you're at your most insane is when you make the decision to commit to stay with someone until death us do part. And it's just that in a work situation, a kind of similar things though happen sometimes, that we're thinking, what is it we need to do? We need to make a major change. We're going to have this new product line. We're going to have to get rid of lots of people, or we're going to take people on, or we're going to move, or we're going to close offices, whatever. And we're doing that often in a rush, and at a time when all these things are in flux. And so the idea of change, change is very stressful anyway for some people, and often the fact is that because we're trying to do it too quickly and without stopping and thinking what are the elements, it can cause even more stress. I mean, even positive change, even really positive change, can cause pressure and stress for people. And so sometimes though, Jo, I think I mentioned this too, but what causes the stress sometimes is the idea of the change.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's almost more worrying for people, and we can't help but talk in team role terms, so we know people's types of behavior, and there are some people, some behaviors where they're going to be really anxious about the idea of that change taking place. Sometimes once it's actually happened, or you're partway through it, it's like many things, the idea of something is worse than actually taking the steps in that forward. Really.
No, absolutely. And there's some great conversations going on in the chat now about never make serious decisions, especially if your EQ is low at the time as well. And yes, there's a lot of communication issues, isn't there? But we are quite adaptable as human beings to change. We do quite like it sometimes. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today, there is actually an article. Actually, I'm just going to share my screen just to show you where it is. For those of you who haven't seen it, see, I'm just desperately trying to find where it is now. Is it that one? I'm not sure. I'm just going to potentially share the wrong thing. Here it is. I think you can see the Belbin website now. Deborah, can you see the Belbin website?
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
I can.
If you go on to that, here we've got a great article written by Victoria, who's our head of R&D, all talking about coaching people through the change curve. So really an in-depth there. We won't talk about all of that detail, but if you wanted to download a copy, please do. It's just there on our website. It's on the home page. I'm just going to stop sharing again now. God, I haven't done this for so long. Okay, so
Jo, there was something you picked up on earlier, and someone actually put it on the on a chat. I noticed. I'm not seeing all the chats, but it was about the communication. Yes, the EQ that one needs, but of course, successful change always depends on how it's communicated and the clarity of the objective as well, and then the buy-in, which I think we'll talk about perhaps in relation to some projects.
Well, I think let's talk about that now, because as always, and it always seems to come up, doesn't it? What a subject, does it? Communication is key. Clarity of what is that change is key. And unless we get those bits right, the change is always going to be, potentially difficult. And I know, Deborah, you've been working with companies, and you worked with a national services provider, if I remember rightly, helping them through change. They were an HR team. Do you want to share? Yeah. That would be quite interesting.
I would like to talk about that one. I've actually made a few notes so that I don't say too much and take too long, which is my specialist coming through, that I might want to give too much information. But essentially, it was an organisation where there was centralised HR, and they were changing to partnerships, business partnerships within HR, and it was going to happen with the rest of the organisation too. But I expect many of you been through this kind of change. I will let you into a secret though. HR, OD, really good at doing this for other departments, but sometimes not quite so keen for themselves. So anyway, the HR director had brought us in to work with the senior leadership team within HR, because the idea was that then this quite large team, actually about 15 people, but we're then going to roll it out through to their teams. So we're talking about, there were quite large numbers we're talking about here. Part of this change was actually to reduce the HR headcount. So there were going to be redundancies, which means that there was fear in there as well. Everyone had done their self-perception and then got observers, of course, in the current structure, and the observers were therefore people who were working with them in HR and were fearful. They were fearful, I think, of putting, those of you who know our reports, talking about the list B words, the negative words. And I don't think I've ever seen as many people who looked as though potentially they were perfect and had nothing wrong with them at all. But in fact, because that could happen quite often, I think can happen under these circumstances. So we then went and we asked the people to get input from the managers who'd been receiving the service, so not in HR, and that was better. It sort of broadened it out a little bit.
Oh, can we just stop a minute there? Sorry, Deborah. Yeah. When you say something and I think, oh, that's really interesting, let's quickly go back. So when you complete the Belbin self-perception inventory, you find out how you feel, your preferences for these 19 roles. Then obviously you need to get feedback from people that you work with, because they're the people who interact with you and work with you. And so we call these observer assessments. Now, the observer assessments, for those who don't know, are just lists of words. And there's list A words, which are all relating to the positive attributes of each of the 19 role behaviours. And the list B words are related to all the allowable weaknesses of each of these 19 roles. And what you expect people to see is, if they're going to see strengths somewhere, you'd expect them to see some of those weaknesses as well. So when observers tick these, you'd expect them to see, for example, and may I put myself out there, I am quite outspoken, I'm quite manipulative. These words I would expect to see because I've got the corresponding strengths. But what you're saying is, because there was change, because people were feeling a little bit threatened, maybe because there was a redundancy possibility, nobody ticked those list B words. Nobody was looking at any of those weaknesses. That's really interesting, isn't it?
Well, I suspect actually that there were a lot of people thinking about the weaknesses of the other people, but they were just feeling, oh, that might be a bit dangerous to do that, because I don't want people to say negative things about me. I mean, I think there was so much buzzing around underneath, really. So anyway,
Sorry, I interrupted you there.
No, please. I'm glad. That was really important, because of course I've been talking about things which the people who are accredited here will know readily, but as we saw from the poll, there are some people who don't know as much. So thanks for that, and pull me up on any of these ones.
So did they have clarity? Did they have understanding of what was going on?
Actually, I'm just going to go on to that. So on the first workshop, what I did was I asked everyone to write down their understanding of the objective of the change and its purpose, and also, and not just, okay, we're moving to business partnerships. I mean, you know, but elaborating a bit on that, and also how this was to be achieved. Now, there was no conferring. People, I love these great big post-it notes, you know, so people had a few of those and they could write their notes on and then stick them up on the wall. And then I had people standing around looking at those, talking about them, looking at where the similarities were, the differences were. And the idea was that they had to come up with an agreement. Because the HR director was in there as well, it wasn't that it was going to go off in a completely different area, but there was to try and get that clarity, exactly what you were asking, Joe, because we assume that people are thinking the same thing very often. We know officially what that end goal is, but sometimes even when the end goal is clear, there's a big difference on how we think we might go about achieving it. And unless you've got that common understanding and you have communicated it, it's not going to work. So there was the part of an exercise for this team was to work on something where they'd got wording that not just the form of words, but they were all buying into. So they did have a common vision and common goal. And what they then did was they actually mapped it out as if it was a project. You know, because we talked about it, the whole thing is that very often change programs, like any other program, you can work it through as if you were working on a project. So they, I mean, with our help, in fact, but went through what were the milestones, the stages that you needed, you know, what are the skills, the behaviours, and so on. There was a deep level of sharing amongst people, and what they felt they could personally contribute, and then what they thought their teams might. So there was a lot of use of the team roles language, and you know, many of you will know this, but those of you who don't, we sometimes talk about having this common language of team roles to enable people in a slightly depersonalized way to address some things that might be more difficult to say otherwise. Or, you know, just looking at Jo and I, so in terms of what she's put up on the board there, you know, it might be that we're having a discussion, and it might be that Jo might say to me, oh, Deborah, a bit too much coordinator going on here. You know, thank you for that. Yes, it is my very bottom role, implementer. So, you know, we haven't got implementer between us, but we need to have a bit of implementer in here, or we need to bring. So it gives a way of being able to talk about things, and it's helpful. Because people were able then to really discuss at a deeper level what their concerns were as well. I think by being open about that, it was contained, people felt able to be open, and the idea of change became a bit less scary. And in fact, quite a few of these people started to see it, as in the senior HR team, were seeing it as an opportunity. Now, I'll skip on. You did, oh, sorry, you'd like to say something?
No, I was just going to say that's really useful, because sometimes change is forced upon us. And that you can have a reaction to that, and that sometimes starts sort of a negative feeling towards that change. But if you feel that even though it's that change, which in this situation was there, but the team were given the autonomy to work out the best way of achieving that, yes, you've then got the engagement of the team there as well, because sometimes we can't all have a say on what that change is going to be. We can't have a say on what it looks like, because it's very often strategic, it's coming from on high. But so if you do want to get engagement with people to actually get there, it's involving them throughout the process, isn't it? But it's involving, like with the project, the right people at the right time.
Exactly, because you're quite right. This whole program of moving to decentralizing was originally very top level from the CEO and the global HRD. So although, as you say, people didn't have the decision about whether that was going to happen, but some of the how meant that they could take that ownership. And given that these were people who then had their own teams as well, they were going to have to, as I say, roll it out there. So I'm going to skip on really to saying the second workshop. So this was a few weeks later, and by then each member of this senior HR team had got a Belbin report for, or their report. So they had a team report and they had information on each of their team members. Those team members had them themselves as well. I don't mean it was shared without their knowledge. And so again, that was self-perception and observer assessment. And then within this second workshop, they started discussing and really building the potential HR business partnership teams. Now, what they did was not just on the basis of one person from each function, within each of these businesses, we want to have someone in recruitment, we want someone OD, but they started looking at what might be good combinations, what sort of balance of, if there were going to be in some cases 3 people, in some cases 4 people, or so people in HR, out in these partnerships, well, looking at those potentially as a team. Now, I'd like to say to you, of course, that was it. Everything was absolutely perfect there. Inevitably, it ended up not being exactly as they've discussed because, there's people involved. And so some of the employees didn't want to move, didn't want to change, but it formed the basis of a really successful, this whole program turned out to be a really successful change program. And in fact, what then happened in most of the businesses, and I'm going like that because they were fairly spread, but within that, the HR teams then set up using Belbin to be able to look at the teams, the operational teams as well. And so I would say that was, looking at those whole mini businesses. So each of the mini businesses, or most of the mini businesses, were then looking at things in terms of team roles, and we're able to have the sorts of discussions we've just been talking about. So it helped, it wasn't just an airy-fairy thing, it actually aided the business. It meant that there was more effective running of the business, so it impacts the bottom line.
I love that, isn't it? Because we sometimes talk about change as a process and we forget about the human element. We forget about the fact that we're all going to think, feel, communicate and everything differently. And by bringing in the Belbin element there, you're bringing in the human into the actual change process. There's some great conversations going on in the chat. I'll just remind you again, if you could make sure it was all panelists and attendees, or whatever you've got, because I think it might be written differently, to make sure that everybody can join in, because if anything, there's some great tops and tips and recommendations for YouTubes and everything in there. So please do. And this is what I love about these webinars, is we managed to create this wonderful environment where people feel really happy sharing all of their knowledge and expertise. So please keep doing so. You talk to me, Deborah. You talk
okay,
about another.
I was going to say, I did want to say about another one, and I just, but it's just, because we've got some really interesting comments there, so we want to have time to speak to some of those. But I thought this is something.
Please, I love this one.
Yeah,
please.
And I think, in fact, there were some very useful aspects that came out of it. So this was a consulting firm. They had some lovely London offices, and we were asked by the ops director to go and work with the facilities management team. And this was just 4 people. They were senior people, highly paid. They'd been tasked with introducing quite a significant change within the, it was changing, renovating the building while people were still in situ. It was introducing new security measures. There'd actually been some terrorist issues. So security and also technology, introducing actually physical wiring and things, she says vaguely. And there were also some health and safety issues. I know it's like, oh no, God, not that. But there had been some complaints from the consultants within this organisation, so the fee earners, about the way the facilities people were going about this change programme. Now, the bit that I remember was to do with lifts. So I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. The facilities team, of course, we got them to do the Belbin questionnaires. They completed those. And in this team, all 4 of these people had as their top 2 team roles, implementer, and then either shaper or completer finisher. In fact, 3 of them had completer finisher, 1 shaper.
Let's pretend we were those people.
Oh yeah, thank you. Actually, yes, and take that's great. Yes, exactly. Just there was one on the shaper. That's it. And then there was 1 or 2 people with specialist, and that was it. I mean, it was one of the most extreme lacks of diversity that I've seen. So let's come to the lifts now. And although that might seem like quite a minor thing, it really encapsulated some of the other problems that were going on with this change. So they had some practices of emergency evacuations and things, and some of the people, well, some of the consultants were using the lifts, and they weren't going to the prescribed areas. Now, the facilities guys had written emails to people, and they'd written really quite detailed documented procedures and things. And when people obviously weren't following these, what did they do? Yes, I mean, they actually wrote more emails and more detailed, specific, longer procedures. So now it was interesting. We were given the go ahead because we said, look, we need to talk to some of the other people in the organisation. We were given the go ahead to work with 2 smallish teams of consultants, and they were Belbined, as they referred to it. So we then had their reports, and we ran short sessions with those teams. Guess what they mostly were? You thought? Guess the sort of profile of these consultants?
Oh, were they a bit more social, perhaps?
Well, yeah, there was some social, but it was social in the Resource Investigator area, and they were also plants and creative, and there was also shaper in there as well. Okay, so right. You know, those roles are not known for their compliance with rules. I mean, they probably weren't even aware of the fact that there's rules to follow, I'm quite sure. So the irony of all of this is that we know that implementers are fantastic about the structure and getting things done, high productivity. What they are known to be not comfortable with usually is change. And they can be a bit resistant to that, so that they favour process. So it would actually turned out that people who were responsible for this change programme were the ones who most probably were not very comfortable with change. And the people who thrive on change, the resource investigators, plant shapers, were being told to follow rules that they weren't even aware of. And obviously the facilities people saw the situation through the lens of their behaviours. So and their communication style, it comes down to communication. They were thinking, look, if people aren't complying, then, you know, we obviously aren't explaining this carefully enough. We're not giving enough detail. So communication was the issue. And, having to recognise there's different styles. So what we actually did was we brought the 2 lots together, the consultants, or some of the consultants here, and the facilities people. And of course, the plants RIs, they came up with some really good suggestions about the way things could be done. And a short while later, it was so wonderful to see, they said, you must come back in and look. And near all the lifts, there were these really fabulous posters. I mean, they were wonderful. They were, they'd had some wonderful ones printed up that were bullet points, colours, interesting things about don't use the lifts when. And when they had an evacuation, they had this, I think it wasn't exactly tannoy, that's very old fashioned, but there was some announcement that went out through the building with some very odd sounds going with it, but people heard, so it wasn't about having to read an email, and it worked. So the message is communication style, and sometimes differences aren't just between 2 people. Like, we were saying, if Joe and I've got similarities, but how that might be, or what might differences be. it can actually be between parts of an organization. You know, it can be teams, it can be departments, parts of an organization. And we know that some behaviors will kind of wind up others, or that there's the potential for problems. Those of you who are accredited will know we talk about the opposites wheel. These are team roles which are particularly different to one another, and understandings or even conflicts sometimes can arise. And of course, it's exacerbated during periods of change. So, in fact, this isn't really the course to the webinar to be talking about that. I realised, sorry, I was getting a bit enthusiastic about my subject there, so I shall hold back looking at the clock.
No, not at all, Deborah. And do you know, if we do want to continue these conversations, please do email us, or, you know, get in contact via social media, whatever you want to do, because there are some great things that are coming up here, and it'd be wonderful to continue those. I think, Deborah, what you've touched upon there, and perhaps we will look in more depth at a webinar, is all about team culture. I mean, Tom and I are talking about culture next week at the webinar. I think that's going to be looking as well at more sort of international culture as well, but even just a culture within those 4 people within the team with the lifts. Really, if they'd have really known about Belbin beforehand, you could have foreseen the situation.
Absolutely.
And sometimes if you think about certain teams that perhaps have all the social roles but very little else, how would they cope with the change? Again, different teams have different propensities, don't they, towards, because they're not all balanced perfectly, you know.
Surprise.
Good. Surprise, surprise. So, you know, we really also need to look at culture and how that influences the change as well. Now, we've spoken about communication being key, and how roughly to keep engagement going. There's so much on this to be had. I'd like to bring it back to what we're doing at the moment with some people with their workshops. We're helping transition back into going from a working from home scenario into back into the office, or half and half. That seems to be where there's a lot of need at the moment. I'm sure a lot of you are feeling, having those conversations as well. And how can we help with that? Because right now we have the luxury of time. We can plan the change. We can take time to ensure that everybody is with us to make that change as effective as possible. So right now, what are we doing to help? And just a few bullet points, Deborah, would be useful, because I'd also like to go through how each team role is dealing with change at the moment as well. Obviously, Belbin measures behaviour. Behaviour changes. Actually, I'm just going to show you.
You've got the slide, behaviour slide. That would be much easier, I think.
Wouldn't it just?
Especially for people who haven't seen that.
Okay, so Belbin measures behaviour, and there's lots of different elements here that inform our behaviour. Our personality is one thing, but also our mental abilities, our values, our experiences, external influences, which I think we're just going to put COVID in now, and also how we learn about each of these team roles. But right now, our behaviour is probably, do you think it's changed, Deborah, over the last 13, 14 months? What do you think?
Well, I think for a lot of people it has. Even if I speak personally, I think mine has to some degree. But you know, certainly it's what we're seeing, and it's what a lot of. I mean, we haven't been doing in-person sessions yet, but we've been running lots of them remotely. And yeah, I think that difference and change, and how people are feeling about themselves. And again, you know, we talked about fear, but I think for a number of people, there's a bit of a feeling of fear, not just will I get COVID if I haven't been vaccinated, but the whole moving away from my comfortable little cocooned place at home and being back in the wild world.
Actually, I'm just going to come off share there, because I'm just going to ask people, do they think that their team roles have changed? Actually,
that would be very interesting.
Do you think that your team role behaviour has changed? We've talked about this briefly, and I have to say at the beginning, I think I went into Resource Investigator overdrive, trying to keep everything together. I think coordinator as well came in there, but I had to find new ways of doing things. We had to evolve, we had to change, we had to suddenly find Zoom, we had to do webinars. We did so much, and I think, I mean, I'm already in the 98th percentile for, all right, I think I went off the scale. God, I was tired. honestly, it hit me about 6 months later, as I think a lot of it did, is actually you can't keep that up. My resource investigators now come right down. And I think you can tell that due to the irregularity now of the webinars, which is now back on track, don't worry. I know that that was a change personally for me. Whether or not it comes back up again, I don't know. But right now my coordinator shaper is far higher than it used to be because of I have this surge of RI that I had, which has now had to come back down. Yeah, a lot of people are saying that they have changed, not necessarily from 9th to 1st, but you have some changes in the order. Some people haven't actually, but they've noticed it actually in others. They've noticed other people changing. And perhaps some team roles have been impacted differently to others. Campbell's saying that perhaps some of the social roles have had to change more because it's had more of an impact perhaps on those as well. So we are going through a period of change. And I think what we said right at the very beginning is we're not necessarily just going to flick back. We are on this personal journey and all of this is informing our behaviour. What this means is, Deborah, is when we're running team sessions right now, are we using the AOSPI and Observer reports from 13 months ago? We try not to, aren't we?
We very much try. I mean, we don't ever say, do your self-perception every year or something. We never say that. We say it's when there's change. But this time round, even where people have done it just say a year ago, certainly we're finding it's worth doing, having that new self-perception, and also then being able to bring people together in their teams and for them to share that with colleagues. So getting input, the observer input from people and how they've been working remotely really, but enabling people to tap back into the self-perception and share that part as well with their colleagues, really open up about that, having a discussion and allowing them to say if there's been things they've been upset about, what they're concerned about. Now, the only thing I would advise on here is that is a useful discussion and it shows that you're caring and you're listening, and that can help people then to come back together and work well. But leave time for that discussion, but not too much time, because I think if there's too much, if there's some anxiety or disaffection or whatever, it's infectious. You know, if you start talking about those problems, it can go on. We don't want to hide them under the carpet, but we don't want to just allow that to be going round and round, because let's face it, there are business objectives as well. So although we want to look at the people aspect, we do need to think what is it the organisation needs, and it can't always be what people want, but you need to try and get the balance.
The balance between the needs of the organisation and the needs of the people. And if people have changed through this 13 months, then we need to talk about it, but not so much that we forget what the objective is. And then to use this new SPI and observers to then use this with the whole team and go, right, this is where we are now. This is the change. This is what we're hoping to happen. How can we use this to facilitate the conversations and the actions to get to there, isn't it? But using it with current data as opposed to pre-COVID data.
Definitely using much more current, yes, absolutely. And I would then say use that current and link it in with, I keep coming back to the project thing, but if you're trying to look at what you're going to be doing, how you're going to use people, then why not look at that as if it's a project anyway?
Yeah, absolutely.
So
and with the project, it's breaking it down into those chunks of work and making sure you're allocating the right people to the right time. So the brainstorming, you're allocating the ideas, the idea behaviours, the people who love coming up with either new ideas or quite blatantly stolen. So that's what you want to do. Make sure the organisation is down with those who have strong implementer. Are you going in the right direction in the first place with your monitor evaluator behaviour? So it's making sure people, and that also means that people are being heard. We talked about communication and engagement, and the best way for doing that is to ensure you're communicating and using people in a way that they understand. And what I'd love to do now is I'm just going to actually just quickly Q&A. Don't worry, we're going to come back to all those very shortly. I just wanted people to know that I'm not ignoring them. I'm just going to share screen and go back to the slides, Deborah. because each of these Belbin team roles manages change differently, doesn't it? How would you, and it's important that we look at each of these very briefly here. Don't worry, we will, just before anybody asks, we will send these out. Don't worry. How do we manage each of those team roles? Well, like we were just saying there with the plants, include them right at the beginning.
Yeah.
Include them if there's any problem solving needed, and give them space to be allowed for their creativity to be able to flourish, to be able to facilitate that in themselves. Anything else you'd say about managing?
I'm just going to say here, Jo, but given I'm keeping an eye on the time too, and I know that but as we're going through these, I think as we're going to send these to people, what might be useful is that perhaps if we just add the bits on that aren't on here. And so in terms of plants, they embrace change. It's their natural state. So though often only their ideas are the best ones, of course, in their opinion. But the thing is that change is never static for a plant. So it may be that you've decided what it is you're working towards and changing. Plants then going to throw some other ideas in too. So just being aware of that. I'll just
perfect. Yes. No. Monitor evaluators, please use them through change, because otherwise, especially if you've got high just get it done roles, that you'll be going at 90 miles an hour in one direction and forgetting to ask, is this perhaps the right way we need to be going? So again, use them quite early on.
Yes, definitely. They're going to ask the questions. Is this change necessary? What, why, when, where, how much is it going to cost? All of these things. I know it might seem to dampen enthusiasm, but they can see the holes in something. And it's better to find that out early on. They can also, because they think long term and strategically, but why don't you have them there so that they are going to identify what might be some of the problems before you get to it. So you're thinking very often, I think you alluded to this, Jo, change is happening sort of fast, even when we think we've got a bit of time, but there's a feeling of the people who are keen on change are the ones who might push and for it to go a little bit quickly. And yet you can save yourself the time by allowing the monitor evaluator to really have looked at all angles, because it'll save you time in the long run. And don't let enthusiasm drown them out. Let them have their voice.
Please give them some space. Please give them space. Otherwise, the engagement goes, and therefore, when you do need them, you have to work harder to get that engagement there. So please, please do. Specialists.
Yeah. Now, well, we can see. Sorry, I'll jump to.
It's making sure that if how many times do we sometimes go through things without checking? Does anybody have a knowledge of this area in the first place? I mean, how many times would it have been lovely had I have known that actually one of our trainers, Gez, is an expert on Zoom, real specialist. If only I'd stopped to think who knows about it, who I can ask. That would have been really useful actually for our own experience, and I didn't do that particularly well. So making sure that you know where they are and to ask, does anybody know something about this, is really, really important.
It is. And where you've got, the thing is, it might be that you don't have anyone who knows about it. Okay, you could bring in someone from outside, but it might be that you then say to your person who's got specialist behavior, they like learning, they're great at researching in depth. So get them to really read about this, understand about it.
Yes.
And what you can hopefully do there is have them then communicate that and explain that to the other people in the team, because it saves everyone in a way. If you think about it, it's like having the manual on something. It saves everyone reading the manual. You've got the person who's motivated by doing it, who loves it. Why not use them?
Absolutely. Every time.
I think that's really key. Yeah.
We now have managing completed finishers through change, and remembering with the completed finishers is they have high levels of anxiety anyway. And it's really that reassurance with completed finishers, wouldn't you say, Deborah, to make sure that actually fast change, it could be that you just have to speed up and sometimes you have to let some of it go, but to make sure that they know that those standards are going to be you know, at some point, that it's not that they're just running roughshod over them, it's appreciating the fact that sometimes we can't stop at every detail. We do need to move on.
Yes, partly I think what I would say is, Jo, that was said very much from a resource investigator shaper perspective.
It may have been. I'm sorry.
So, yes. It's about saying for the reason that they are anxious and that are worried is because these really high standards, and usually they're setting a standard for themselves which is higher than their manager or the company might be setting. So I do agree, we have to make sure.
Oh, sorry, it's all gone wrong.
We have to make sure that there are realistic deadlines, and give them, yeah, that reassurance. I do agree with that, but I think it's important that we understand why they might be concerned. It's because they want it to be fantastic.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So who have we got next coming up?
So sorry.
Shapers. We better move quickly. Is that the idea?
On! Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Shapers are like, okay, what are we waiting for?
Get it done
now. Yeah, exactly. High energy, as Jo, you'd said at the beginning. They're bothered about that end goal, bottom line, and just getting there. They might rush at things, and it can sound great. Other people will follow them. But is it the right, you know, are they following in the right, are they going in the right direction? And that's where, you know, if you haven't tapped into your monitor evaluator, you could have a problem, because for them, process and who's doing it doesn't matter much. It's getting to that end goal quickly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, and the true shape behaviour next.
Okay.
So we're going to go through, don't worry, like, so we are handing these out to you. So how would you manage the implementers? I mean, it's using them to talk about the practical stuff, isn't it? I mean, this is where we would fall down, Deborah, when we started to ask at the very beginning. We need the implementers to help us turn all of this into some action, to help them create process, to help them plan the change. And although they are the team role that you always say is resistance to change, I know that we've always said that if you can really get the implementer on board early, they can actually plan the change for you.
Well, yes, and what they can do, they're not resisting change just for its own sake. If they're a good implementer, it's usually because they know that change is going to mean that you're losing some things. You may lose that productivity for a while, and the speed could be reduced. So get them on board early, not at the discussion stage, but early enough on so they can map out a change. And then it's contained, and then you'll get their buy-in, and it means also that it can work better for other people. You've got that whole change. But if you are talking to them about what the change is, that end goal, you know, we talked about clarity. This is even more important here, and that's because if there's any ambiguity about it, then you won't get the best from the implementer.
Absolutely. I'm going to have to go to the next one now, which is the coordinator. And when we're talking about breaking down the changes into like a project and chunks of work that needs to be done, it really is the coordinator who is fabulous at making sure they're allocating the right work to the right people. So bring them in for that broader picture, bring them in to make sure that the right people are being used at the right time, but just make sure they don't get a little bit too controlling.
Yeah. But then absolutely. And they also, what they're going to be doing is really good at helping everyone to see that end goal, that clarity we keep talking about, but they will be the ones to make sure that it is understood, it's explained and understood, and who to bring in. The other thing to say about them briefly is we're talking about stress and so on. They tend to stay calm and steady, so they can be very good about who's not on board or who's worried about the change.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, you're right. They're a good calming influence for the team, actually, aren't they? And the other great influence with the team are the team workers, you know, the ones with the listening. While the shape is going on at 90 miles an hour, this is where we're going, and they have a wake of people in lots of people in their wake. This is where the team workers really come in, because they can listen to the actual concerns and the fears and the worries of everybody around them. So they're there to boost the team, aren't they?
But completely. But something I want to point out here, which I've been noticing over the last 6 months or so, and that's that quite often with the team workers and change, they're becoming a little bit overloaded because they're the person that others go to and they confide in. Now, usually if you're talking about something to, let's say, this team worker, it's concerns about various things, and they sometimes therefore hear the negative side. And if you're asking the team worker to report on what's happening, what the, have you got finger on the pulse, you might get more of the negative, because they're wanting what's best for people, they're concerned about people, but the others who aren't having any problem with the change, who are sailing through it, will probably won't go and talk to those team workers anyway.
So you're only getting one side.
Yeah, you're getting a bit of a distorted view if you're not careful. So just to make sure also that the team work is not being kind of dumped on, really, or that their well-being is looked after as well.
Absolutely. And then last but not least on here, we have the resource investigator, and you need their enthusiasm. You need their, come on, it's going to be fabulous. It's going to be brilliant. You need some of that, don't you, to lift the team. Yeah. But very useful in the ideas, as in who's done this before? What can we learn by what other people have done? So looking outside of the team for some help as well. And they just might know people who might make the transition a lot easier.
Yeah, they might. I've got just a couple of things very briefly here, because they are in their element here, and at least it's not routine if there's change and so on. Now, and this is what's happened, in fact, in a few situations, but there was one that was problematic. Sometimes they're so excited by the change, so enthusiastic, they rush off and tell people about it. And sometimes it can be necessary to hold them back, especially when they're sharing on social media before everyone's fully understood the change. And in fact, I will, obviously you wouldn't know who it was, but there's one client where a change was inadvertently shared on LinkedIn before it had been formally announced. Ouch. It actually impacted on the share price, and it alerted their competitors. I mean, that was an extreme, I know it's not, but I'm just flagging that up. So that wonderful enthusiasm, connecting, let's put it out there, just be a wee bit careful.
Doesn't time go quickly when you're having fun, doesn't it? It's amazing. So what we've done over the last 60 minutes is just talked really sort of loosely about change, and how Deborah has worked with teams going through change, and how the importance of communication, the importance of clarity, the importance of treating everybody, well, just not treating everybody the same, and understanding that these differences are going to have an effect on how change happens. We've also talked about right now, when changing the ways that we work, is that what we need to ensure that we are doing is looking at how we are now, because we've all been on our own change journey over the last 30 months to ensure that actually you're not referring back to Joe Keeler last year. It's Joe Keeler now actually as part of the team, and what they're able to give and how you're able to use them. We've gone through each of those team roles and how to manage those through change as well. So as always, we've tried to keep here, but there's just so much, isn't there? There's so much we can talk about, but what we hope we've done is helped you understand how the language of Belbin can help these. It's not the only answer. Oh my goodness, there's so many other things to consider as well, but how the language of Belbin can really, really help make that transition. Yeah. There's been some great chat, and what I am going to do is I'm going to copy and paste that, and I will send it out tomorrow with the recording, because if anything, I want to have a look at some of the books.
Yes, yes, I was going to say, I
want that. Absolutely. So we will do that. I'm just going to quickly pop onto the Q&A. Yes, the team circle, which we use all the time, and it's just a wonderful way of getting that communication started. Opposites do work well together, but they also do clash. It's an interesting one. It depends how you want to use the circles. I'm just asking how you use it. This is more just putting as the social thinking and action roles, and then you can kind of see the culture of the team. You can see where the main bits of the stickies are, and where the gaps and the overlaps are. You can then draw a slightly different one that looks at the opposites, and that's where we're putting the plant opposite with the implementer, for example, and that's where clashes do occur unless They have understanding and appreciation of difference and diversity, and a language to be able to talk about it, Deborah. And therefore it becomes an amazing working relationship.
Yes, it can be really complementary, and yes, very good indeed. So that's the aim of it, not to say, oh, there's problems, but to say, okay, there could be, so how are you going to deal with it? How can you understand one another? And it comes down to respect. Can you respect that difference? And again, having the language, you got the message.
Absolutely. There's another great question there, is especially throughout change, is if you have a coordinator in the team, do you need a shaper too? Because both the shaper and the coordinator are quite dominant roles, aren't they? They're both quite strong roles within a team. Are they interchangeable? I know, well, I'd say no.
Oh, that's such a big subject, but I think, yes, basic answer is no. But and interestingly, if they're at the same level, there can be a bit of a clash between them, because they're going about things in a different way. One's trying to do things through people and kind of asking, if you like, and one is telling. And it's not that one side is right and one's wrong, but I wouldn't say they're interchangeable. I think that you need both of them at different
really distinct times. Actually, they're both at my top roles, coordinator, shaper, and I have to be really conscious of when I'm taking one off and one on, because you have to play them very differently. Just to say, I think it's John here, so it's cut off the end of your name. In terms of change, how can I help my team stop booking back-to-back meetings? I've noticed some people on this call are suffering with that, yes, which is fine. Do you know a top tip that I was given by Patrick and Anton, who work over in the States, who work with us a lot? Only ever book meetings, never book them on the hour. Always try and make sure that when you are booking meetings, it's never on, because otherwise you get 2 till 3, 3 till 4, 4 till 5. Make sure you've always built in a 20-minute gap in between all of your meetings, and it gives everybody time to breathe. And also that stops that constant just rolling meeting syndrome that I think a lot of us have. So always book meetings for 20 past the hour and until 0:00. Really can help. But that's more of a cultural thing perhaps, isn't it? That constantly booking Zooms again and again and again. Deborah, do you have any advice?
Well, no, I don't know about advice. Actually, I think that for well-being and eye health and all the rest of it, it is important to leave enough gaps. Or what I've also done is not really saying about the between meetings, but I try to make sure that on a Zoom meeting, you spend some of the time with people standing up. You can just adjust things, but I actually would say people stand up to have the discussion, make sure that they're looking in different ways. That's not, and it's not what you were asking. In terms of the meetings, I actually just think it's important to kind of just say, can't do it at that time, at that day. But as you say, culturally, I'm not sure I can add.
There's a good conversation actually. I think to be continued, John and Gary. That's seem to give the same advice as you as well. Is people want to prove that they're working because they're working from home, and so you have to be visible. That comes down to trust.
Yeah,
that is a trust. If your team feel, do they know? Do you trust them to be working? I'm sure you do, but do they know that? It's the communication of that as well, isn't it? Is do they have the trust there?
And I think actually, and I know what we do, in fact, but is to make sure that every day there is a meeting time when we do just all get together, even sometimes for quite a short time, but that is a sort of static, and then understand what's going on. So people might say, well, you know, I'm not going to be sitting at my desk all the time, but I'm going to get on with this work.
Perfect. And I appreciate that lots of you have got other meetings to go to, so please don't feel that you have to stay. Please, thank you to everybody. Thank you for staying for so long and listening to Deborah and I having a conversation about what change, which we're all going through so much of at the moment. I would just reiterate that all of this is going to be sent out to you, so don't have any FOMO, don't have any fear of missing out. Everything will be there. If you've got any other questions, please just put them in. I will make sure that they are all answered. Perhaps we ought to have whole day webinars, but I don't know if I can do that. No. To do that, we will continue chatting until everybody you know, just finishes everything, and then we'll go and have a cup of tea. And of course, if you would love to join us next week, I've got Tom Robson, who I've been working with for 20 odd years. Debbie, you've been working with for the same amount of time. He's been doing so much work with culture, and he knows worked a lot with Hans Trompedas et al., hasn't he?
Yes,
and
it's accredited.
Accredited in that area, and has used that knowledge along with his Belbin knowledge worldwide, looking at Belbin and culture. So that's going to hopefully be an interesting one. Will it be as lively as this though, Deborah?
Well,
we'll find out, won't we?
Team roles,
tune in to find out.
There'll be lots of depth. There will be lots of depth of information.
There will be, absolutely.
And just to say, by the way, that in terms of change, if there are particular things that you are interested in, do get in touch with us. Or if you're working with clients where you're going to be using Belbin with change, we're very happy to give some additional suggestions and things related to the way that you want to be applying Belbin.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you just want somebody to talk about Belbin generally for 40 minutes, not very good on the full hour, please send us an invite. I'd love to be involved. I think my Resource Investigator is coming back, Deborah. I think it is, isn't it? Just get me in front of people. I just like talking. It's fantastic. So thank you so much to everyone for doing. Oh my goodness, I'm scrolling through. Link for the next webinar. That's a really good question. Let me find it. In fact, what I'm going to put in there.
Won't you be sending it out anyway?
Yes, I know, Deborah, but let me do this because it looks like I can multitask.
Oh gosh.
Okay, what I'm putting in there is the link to all of our webinars. And not only have you got future ones to book, you've also got a list of all of our webinars that we've had so far with a link to YouTube, the YouTube recording. So there's a whole there. Please bear with us. We're going through at the moment and trying to edit them because we did everything very quickly, and now we're going back and making sure that so you may want to fast forward the beginnings on some of them, but there's some fabulous stuff. We've had some great guests join us, and I'm sure you'll learn a lot. We've had great things about leadership, leadership within teams. I love that one with Patrick. We've looked at agile teams, we've looked at recruitment, we've looked at the use
appreciative inquiry.
Appreciative inquiry, yes. And that's another one. We've got a workshop coming on about that. Yeah. That's another thing that we've got. Yes, and Belbin workshops. Carson, I had some questions around people being typecast in their team roles and how they get out of it once they're managed. I think what we'll do, Deborah, is we'll have that as a whole webinar, because I think how you then manage, once you've got your report and once you've been using Belbin as a team, what do we need to do to ensure that one of those things is that we're not typecast?
Absolutely.
That's so important.
Oh, vital.
And actually, how much have we had? I've worked with teams where the people have just said, I'm not really high completer finisher. I'm not. It's just that I'm more so than anybody else, but I keep get given that role.
Relative
what
to.
What do we do? Yes.
Why don't we have that one? And we can include in that, I think, the sort of, how a team can be high performing if people use that, but don't just become static.
Absolutely, because we need to change, don't we? And some of us have roles that we've never even played before, which we might be absolutely incredible in, but we've just never been given the opportunity because we've always been here. So yes, let's do that. I think that would be a really, really good idea.
Would be.
Yeah. Stereotyping. We all hate stereotyping, don't we? I think sometimes that is one of the benefits of Belbin, because although the language is I am a plant, actually in real terms, if you use Belbin properly, that's not what we say at all. We say, where are our top 2 or 3 contributions that we can make? When do we need to step up? When do we need to delegate? Learning your timing of your contribution and everything else as well. But we do need to be really careful, because it's sometimes easy to slip into that language, isn't it?
Yes.
Of that stereotype. It is easy to do so.
I would say it was interesting, because I noticed it was Linda Keller who'd put something about that, and I know that she's someone who is so good at making sure people do not put the label on and a stereotype. So yeah, it's a very important issue.
Yeah, and somebody else is saying again, love a webinar on typecasting. So brilliant. That's sorted. We'll go and write that this afternoon, and we'll come back to you with a date. Brilliant. We'll leave it now. What I am going to do is, you see, if you all know Zoom really well, because you all use it all the time, I'm sure, and you can just cross your fingers and hope that all chat has actually being picked up, but sometimes it doesn't.
Oh.
So at the moment, you can't see what I'm doing. I'm just copying and pasting all of the, God, that's a long chat. I will do that. Okay, there's a couple of other questions on the Q&A. One person asked, how do you get the Belbin reports? Well, obviously, the only way of finding out your Belbin strengths and weaknesses and the ones in the middle is by completing the Belbin self-perception inventory and getting feedback from others. You don't have to get the feedback from others, but I tell you what, it's blinking useful. I'd say it's not really Belbin without it. And you can do that via our website. So just go to belbin.com. Everything is online. Everything is, I'd like to say straightforward, but then that's me saying that. It's really easy to use, and it costs around about £35 plus VAT per person. So it's not gonna break the bank either. Right, I'm just going here. I just realised nobody can see my screen, so that's a good thing. I'm just going into Word now, just copying all of that in.
All we can see is you.
Yeah, but you can see me. My tongue's going to come out in a minute. I'm concentrating. Okay, I've got that in there now. Now I'll go back to the Zoom. Just got 2 new messages. Thank you. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, everybody else. Wonderful. So. And I shall. Resistance to change, Amy, we will definitely talk to you about that. So sorry we haven't answered your question now, but we will definitely answer that for you. So thank you, everybody, for joining in. And goodbye. Thank you very much.
Yes,
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye. It's so good when people are just sending in such interesting comments and things.
Isn't it? Yeah, I know. There's pages and pages.
Questions.
Yeah.
I was just you know, sort of found my eyes going down a few times. They look so interesting, and then
Stop getting distracted.
I'm getting distracted from what I'm saying.
Right, I'm going to press the button. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.